Basil II the Bulgar Slayer ruled the Byzantine world for nearly 50 years, becoming one of the greatest rulers of the Middle Ages, presiding over dazzling victories in both East and West, cultivating prosperity, and overseeing an intellectual revival. Basil II's reign is widely considered to be Byzantium's zenith. Yet, we are equipped with sufficient evidence so that we can see Basil's all-too-human faults. More interestingly still, we also know that while he would go on to achieve greatness and legendary status, it was only after he had been on the throne over a decade when he fully established himself as ruler of the state, and he also had to experience a good number of failures before he really figured things out. Ultimately, these early failures and frustrations would forge him into the model soldier emperor who would immortalize himself as Byzantium's most beloved and feared monarch. This video focuses on the first 13 years of Basil's reign, beginning with his apprenticeship in government under his great uncle, his struggles to overcome two formidable generals who desired his throne, and the beginnings of Basil's long-standing blood feud with Samuel's resurgent Bulgarian Empire. Only after the travails and tribulations of his early reign would Basil II emerge as a still youthful version of the gray-bearded legend so well known to all students of Byzantine history. Born in 958, Basil was the son of the future Emperor Romanus II and his wife Theophano, a common woman from the Peloponnese whose beauty had won her the heart of the emperor-to-be. At the time of Basil's birth, his grandfather, Constantine VII, one of the greatest scholars in Byzantine history, was still alive. Most likely, Romanus decided to name his firstborn son Basil as an attempt to win his father's favor. His father had not been entirely pleased with Romanus's choice of a common woman for a wife, and he had explicitly written about how emperors should marry very carefully. One way to help mend that fence between father and son would be to honor the memory of the dynasty's founder, Basil I, the Macedonian, someone whom Constantine VII had devoted a great deal of time and effort to rehabilitating through a biography. So Basil II most likely was given his name in order for Romanus II to impress his dad. A year later, Constantine VII died, and now Romanus became emperor in his own right. Basil, for his part, would now be joined by two younger siblings. His brother Constantine was born in 960, and they, throughout their entire lives, would work together. We don't know exactly how close they were. Supposedly, they were very different temperamentally, but they do seem to have enjoyed at least a functional relationship. And for the most part, they did work together smoothly as a team. While Basil will be the official emperor from 976 on, Constantine will also technically be co-emperor and will be doing some things on the side which are probably a little more important than they appear at first blush, but we'll come back to that when we talk about Constantine VIII as sole emperor. At any rate, they got along just fine. There was no fighting between them, so far as we can tell. The youngest sibling was Anna Porphyrogenita, who was born in 963, just a few days prior to Romanus II's untimely death while still in his early 20s. The untimely death of Romanus left the three children in a pretty precarious state. Their mother, Theophano, as I've already noted, was not of noble birth, and so she did not have any kind of deep links. The idea of setting up a regency headed by this peasant empress was something which was bound to attract a good deal of negative attention from the Anatolian military aristocracy, which was becoming increasingly powerful. So it was unlikely that things would go smoothly, and there was a pretty good chance that the 5-year-old Basil would not be able to assume the throne upon reaching the age of adulthood. Since I've already made videos about the reigns of both Nicephorus II Phocas and John I Zimisces, I won't go through their reigns in any great detail here. Suffice it to say that these are the two soldiers who managed to put themselves on the throne in Basil's stead, ostensibly as guardians. Luckily for Basil and his siblings, however, both Phocas and Zimisces did not have direct male heirs. The greater threat of the two of them was actually Nicephorus, who came first, because while he did not have sons of his own, he did have 3 adult nephews, all of whom were very ambitious, and he was by far the greatest threat to blocking Basil's path to power. As it turns out, however, Nicephorus was assassinated by his nephew John Zimisces, who also didn't have a son, and who conveniently died in 976 at only about 50 or 51 years old, at the same exact time that Basil himself had just turned 18. While Zimisces did not have sons, and while he had made no moves to depose Basil or Constantine, it seems rather unlikely that he would have simply waited till he died and then handed over the reins of the state to Basil, or that he would have started sharing power with Basil as he began to slow down several years down the line. So his death at this time was quite convenient for Basil, and that led to some speculation that Basil's uncle, Basil Lecapenus, may have poisoned Zimisces. That's relatively unfounded. Zimisces did campaign quite a bit, and although 50 was not all that old even back then, it was still old enough that someone could keel over without it being all that suspicious. Again, think of the state of medical science. So, this was simply good luck for Basil II. He had been born in the purple, and apparently God was on his side and wanted him to be emperor. But it still wouldn't come together quite this neatly or easily, as we'll see. According to the biographer Michael Pacellus, Basil II was thrilled at the chance of finally getting to exercise power. However, the 18-year-old emperor quickly found that he was in over his head, so he turned to his great-uncle Basil Lecapenus for help. For the next 9 years, Basil Lecapenus would be the chief power in the state, and although it is normally portrayed as Basil Lecapenus calling all the shots, there are glimpses here and there that Basil II is still relatively active, even if he is only playing a somewhat secondary role. Born around 925, Basil Lecapenus was an illegitimate son of Romanus I Lecapenus and Basil's great-uncle. As a eunuch, he was not eligible for the throne, so he was no threat to the young emperor. Basil Lecapenus had a wealth of varied experience. He had been a field commander. At one point, he was considered for the command of the Cretan expedition. He also had been a senior administrator. He was first appointed by Constantine VII, who at first had some reservations about reviving the power of members of the Lecapenus family, but had then entrusted him as a major administrator. And Lecapenus had then served as a senior guy for both Nicephorus Phocas and John Zimisces. It is very likely also that Lecapenus was privy to the plot against Nicephorus, and that Zimisces rewarded him for essentially staying out of the way and helping to then smooth things over after Nicephorus's murder. Some of our sources also say that Zimisces was murdered by Lecapenus because he wanted to cover up his corruption. Supposedly, when Zimisces was coming home from his last campaign, he noticed how many estates belonged to the eunuch Basil Lecapenus, and he thought that he had become too corrupt and needed to be removed. Most likely the story was invented, and it was more or less just a case of the tropes of greed and untrustworthiness being leveled against eunuchs. At any rate, even if this had been true, Basil II is highly unlikely to have cared how Zimisces died, since it benefited him, and since he also trusted his uncle to work on his behalf. Pacellus tells us that Basil II had long been close with his uncle, and that the two of them had a good relationship. This makes sense because Lecapenus would have been the only real member of the family around other than Basil's younger siblings after their mother Theophano was sent to a convent. Speaking of Theophano, early on in his reign, one of the first things that Basil did was to recall her from the convent so that she could return to court. Although Basil was only 18 at the time of his accession in 976, most of the core components of his personality were already in place. Over time, of course, he would evolve, but for the most part, he remained pretty similar. From the outset, Basil was a fairly cold, harsh, autocratic guy without a very well-developed sense of humor. It's pretty clear that he was very serious-minded and didn't really have all that many hobbies or interests aside from ruling the empire. He was intelligent, but he had limited to no intellectual interest outside of things directly relevant to the governing of the empire. It appears that in that kind of period of tutelage that he had under Basil Acopanus, that he was never truly happy. He did indulge himself in women and wine, but he doesn't seem to have really delighted in either of those things, and supposedly when he took over the government full-time in 985, he completely eschewed women for the rest of his life. It seems that young Basil was really molded by the loneliness and sense of responsibility he had as a child. Technically, from the age of 5 onwards, he was one of the emperors, and he perhaps expected himself to be able to really run the show and look out for the good of the empire. This is something that he took extremely seriously, and it more or less became the be-all and end-all of his personality. It's also possible that he experienced some real unhappiness during this time, since his early attempt at governing had been something of a failure. So perhaps for a while he thought himself unworthy, and he tried to find some consolation in the court life, ultimately finding that was unsatisfying. So then he devoted himself to gaining the knowledge and the confidence to rule in the autocratic style that he thought was appropriate. By contrast, his brother Constantine VIII seems to have been a pretty jolly guy. He seems to have had a great deal more charisma than Basil. People seem to have liked him a good deal more. He was also much better looking. He was tall and athletic, and at one point he was described as looking very heroic in one of the battles in a later civil war, whereas no one ever said that about Basil. They said that he could be imposing and intimidating, but no one ever described him as strikingly handsome or athletic or fearsome looking or anything like that. So there is perhaps also a little bit of sibling rivalry in the sense that Basil may have been slightly jealous of his brother for winning the genetic lottery, whereas he seems to have gotten none of his grandfather's height, his father's athleticism, or his mother's good looks, whereas his brother Constantine got all of those things. Basil Acopanus knew that the greatest potential challenge to his grandnephew's throne came from the east. After all, it had been the eastern armies which had produced and promoted 2 different emperors who had served as guardian for Basil in the past, and it was unlikely that other ambitious generals would be willing to set aside this new precedent if it meant that they might have a shot at becoming emperor. There was one person in particular who was a problem at this time, Bardas Sclerus. Sclerus had been one of Zimisce's top generals and had also been his brother-in-law at one point. Accordingly, he was in a great position just by virtue of that. He was the senior general in the East. He had won a good number of victories, especially early on in Zimisce's administration, so he felt like he was owed something. In addition, Sclerus had some genuine ties to the Macedonian dynasty itself. One of the major figures in his family's history was Bardas, a younger brother of Basil I. This meant that Sclerus, in theory, not only could take the throne, but possibly pass it on to his children, conveniently knock off Basil, Constantine, and the others, and then say that the Macedonian dynasty was continuing unabated. So Sclerus was a legitimate threat. Sclerus, therefore, had to be dealt with, so he was removed as domesticus of the East and then reassigned to be the Dukes of Mesopotamia. Still a powerful office, but not nearly so powerful as the Domesticus. Petros, a more reliable man, was made Domesticus, and Michael Bortzes, who had held this office since the time of Nicephorus Phocas, was retained at Antioch. Lecapenus felt like this arrangement would be enough to keep Sclerus happy without giving him enough power to revolt. However, this proved to be a miscalculation, and Sclerus would soon prove himself to be a formidable and very clever opponent. For context, when Basil II assumed the full authority of the emperor, this was seen as a natural development by most people. After all, Basil had been designated as an emperor to be from the time of his birth, and this was him simply getting his birthright. He was a full-grown adult by this point, and his accession was by no means controversial. However, Sclerus, to his great credit, was able to gain a moderate number of followers when he declared himself to be Basileus, just 1 or 2 months after Zimisces' death. The fact that he was able to gather even a moderate army, just large enough to justify a revolt, is quite a testimony to his ability to persuade people to follow him and the strength of his resume as a commander. Pacellus describes Sclerus as extremely clever in carrying out his schemes, something that we will see to be true. Sclerus is actually a very good general, and he's able to overperform what seems to be possible given his position. Sclerus is wealthy, he has royal blood, a successful record, and he seems to be popular with the troops. Despite the fact that he was getting long in the tooth at this point, he was probably over 60, Sclerus also seems to have been really good at inspiring his men and also in providing them with quality leadership that earned their loyalty. In recent years, Anthony Caldelas has raised the question as to what was the real purpose of Sclerus' revolt. He suggests that perhaps Sclerus was merely testing the strength of the administration in Constantinople and perhaps was looking for some kind of concessions. To me, this line of reasoning doesn't make much sense, and I think that Sclerus was a very much traditional usurper. Perhaps he believed the rumors that Lecapenus had murdered his friend Zimisces. Perhaps he thought that a member of the military aristocracy, someone with a proven track record, should serve as emperor. There are a number of things which could have impelled him to revolt. Also, we should keep in mind that his sudden timing, that is to say, the short amount of time between Zimisces' death and Sclerus' declaration, has to be kept in the context of Sclerus' age. At 60 or older, he was someone whom the biological clock was ticking against. His time for leading armies and winning military glory was limited, so he needed to move quickly and secure either some massive command or some role as co-emperor in order to achieve glory before he kicked the bucket or at least grew too old to go out and command armies. Sclerus' son managed to escape Constantinople to join his father, and Sclerus' forces captured the key city of Melitene and used that as a primary operating base. Sclerus also formed an alliance by marriage with Abu Taglib and got auxiliary cavalry from this alignment. So, for me, again, I just don't see the validity of the argument that this was simply a chin check on Constantinople. I think instead this was a full-fledged revolt with the explicit object of installing Sclerus as one of the emperors, or even better, as the emperor. Basil II was known for having a bit of a temper, so perhaps Sclerus thought that the young emperor would march headlong into Asia Minor, meet with a massive defeat, and then leave Sclerus as emperor. Of course, things didn't work out that way, but it wasn't an unreasonable assumption given what ends up happening and also given Basil's early inclinations toward autocracy and also the way he ended up conducting his first ever campaign once he ousted Lecapenus. It seems that Sclerus actually did have a good deal of strategic insight and knew exactly what he was doing here. Early on, due to the relatively modest size of Sclerus' following, the court seems to have been fairly optimistic about their odds of dealing with Sclerus quickly and relatively efficiently. The court sent a bishop to negotiate with Sclerus, probably hoping that he would stay in his home district and then await the imperial army, which would bring overwhelming force. However, Sclerus decided instead to move into Cappadocia and try to seize the important city of Caesarea. It appears that the imperial armies were also massing in Cappadocia, and so there was a probably somewhat unexpected clash in the district of Lycandus. Here, Sclerus squared off against Petrus, the Domesticus of the East, Melinus, the governor of Tarsus, and Bortses, the governor of Antioch. Sclerus managed to defeat the imperial army, after which Bortses defected to him, possibly due to the fact that with Sclerus' latest victory, Bortses was now behind enemy lines, and also perhaps because his men had gone over to Sclerus' side. It appears that most of the imperial troops who survived the battle did also join Sclerus. Now, this rebellion had gone from being a rather moderate-sized problem to a massive one. The court was duly panicked. The defeat in Cappadocia seems to have greatly shaken Lecapenus' faith in the ability of Petrus to successfully prosecute the war, so he dispatched the eunuch Leo to join Petrus and take over authority for the conduct of the conflict. The imperial army regrouped in Phrygia, and rather than seeking a decisive battle with Sclerus, they instead decided to try to weaken him by using money to bribe his men. For the most part, this strategy failed, but it did demonstrate to Sclerus the importance of continuing to win battles. The imperial court still had him massively outgunned in terms of resources, while Sclerus probably had higher quality troops at this juncture. Sclerus sent Bortses out to shadow the imperial army without engaging. At a certain point, both Bortses and Leo learned that the tribute convoy from Aleppo was moving through Phrygia toward Constantinople. This would have been a hefty payday for either side, especially the rebels. So both forces moved on this convoy, and in the ensuing battle, Leo was able to rout Bortses. Rebellions against the imperial government in Byzantium tended to be very risky enterprises, and there was very little margin for error on the part of the would-be usurper. So Sclerus was duly alarmed by this development and decided that he had to act quickly before the morale of his army completely collapsed. The imperial commander Leo followed up his victory in Phrygia by ordering a massacre of Bortses' Armenian soldiers. This further reduced the morale and cohesion of Sclerus' ranks, and men were finally beginning to desert, trying to get some of the imperial largesse that was being offered to them. Sclerus therefore knew that he had to seek out a decisive battle as quickly as possible while his army was still somewhat together in order to keep his rebellion going, and that is precisely what he did. For their part, the imperial army was also feeling confident after recent developments, and so the two forces clashed at Ragii. Sclerus was able to win the battle in decisive fashion, with Petrus being killed in action, and Leo apparently being thoroughly humiliated enough that he does not appear again as a commander. Sclerus then marched to Nicaea and managed to take the city after a siege and negotiated surrender where the population was withdrawn across the Bosporus. Sclerus' son Romanus was able to take Abydos, and now Sclerus was in a position to potentially invade Europe. Things were looking bleak. After Ragii, Basil Lecapenus implemented a threefold strategy to get the imperial war effort back on solid footing, and finally put to bed the revolt of Bardas Sclerus. First of all, a diplomatic mission was dispatched to Hubayt Allah by offering to make him governor of Antioch for life if he would switch sides. This worked, and in early 978 he did switch sides, thus creating a revolt in Sclerus' rear. It does not seem, however, that this deal was honored for long, either that or Hubayt Allah did not live all that much longer. The other key component to the strategy was using the Imperial fleet, which was still loyal, to keep the rebels out. The Imperial fleet was able to hold the straits and prevent Sclerus' army from crossing into Europe and laying siege to Constantinople. Bardas Phocas was recalled. He had been a rebel in 970 who had tried to overthrow Zimisces in the name of his fallen uncle Nicephorus II Phocas. The recall of Bardas Phocas seems to have been in the hope of detaching the loyalty of the soldiers in the east. If they saw that a Phocas was fighting on behalf of the throne, then this would make them want to serve under Phocas and the Macedonian dynasty. Or at least that was the hope. Bardas Phocas was not by any means the commander that either his father or uncle had been, but he did have a magic name, and he also was well known as a great warrior. The name Phocas had a magical quality to it among members of the military aristocracy from Anatolia, as the Phocades were the most highly regarded of these families. Later on, Pacellus will tell us that Basil II worked hard to purge the Phocades. However, this cannot have truly been accurate, since as late as 1022, Basil would appoint one of Bardas' sons named Nicephorus to an office. So while later on Basil would have to reduce the role of the Phocades, this does not mean that he eliminated the family, as Pacellus seems to imply with the way that he talks about Basil's relationship with this family. Hopefully that wasn't too many spoilers, since we are getting ahead of ourselves chronologically, but I thought that I would go ahead and take that detail out now. The overall strategy of the Byzantine court was to try to pull Sclerus' troops away from the coast where they might get lucky and find ships, and instead pull them into the interior of Anatolia where they would not be an immediate threat to the safety of Constantinople and the throne. To a certain extent, the strategy worked completely even in the early rough stages. Bardas Phocas took an army composed of mostly Western units, managed to steal a march past Sclerus, and then rendezvoused successfully with Melinus' loyal force near Caesarea in Cappadocia. Despite pulling off a fairly impressive march, however, Sclerus was in hot pursuit, and the two armies clashed at Pancalea, a city near Amorium, on June 19, 978. This battle resulted in another victory for Sclerus, and it is possible that he pursued Phocas and inflicted a couple of other minor defeats. Pancalea was not a decisive battle, but it was a fairly substantial defeat for Phocas. He was beaten to the extent that he could not winter in Byzantine territory, but rather was forced to travel to the territory of David III of Upper Tau to winter his army for 978 to 979. Speaking of David III, it is now time to take a look at him and his realm, since this was one of the more interesting neighbors of Byzantium at this time. David III was a Georgian ruler who reigned from 966 until his death in 1000. He was a member of the Kartvelian branch of the Bagratid royal family, and he was engaged in a struggle to oust the kings of Abkhazia and forge a new kingdom. He had adopted a son who was also a distant relative, and he was using his adopted son as kind of the face of his new kingdom. That being said, it was clear that David III was the real power behind the throne and the architect of this rising Kartvelian power. David had some pre-existing links to the Roman court. His court itself was a mixture of Georgians and Armenians. However, he did observe a number of Byzantine customs, as you can see from the art here, where he is portrayed in Byzantine fashion. He also held a Byzantine court title. He had been making a great deal of progress in just the last few years. In 975, he had acquired a major territory, and at the time of Phocas' arrival, he was in the middle of another successful campaign to extend his territory. Supposedly, David was so confident in Phocas's chances of eventually crushing Sclerus, and so desirous of furthering his ties with Rome, or Byzantium in this case, that he lent Bardas Phocas some 12,000 men for his 979 campaign against Sclerus. David III, if nothing else, had a talent for picking the winning side when it wasn't entirely obvious who was going to win. Not long after the start of the campaigning season on March 24, 979, Phocas and Sclerus met in a pitched battle once again at a place called Charcianon. In this battle, Phocas and his Kartvelian allies managed to win a decisive victory, and this effectively ended Sclerus' revolt. At the site of Charcianon, there's a Georgian inscription honoring one of the soldiers who fought there and later founded a chapel. Sclerus fled east looking for help and eventually ended up living under house arrest in Baghdad with 300 of his closest followers. I won't go through the details of how he arrived at that place, but I will go into that level of detail when I do a video specifically about Bardas Sclerus. So if you're curious about that story, stay tuned to the channel and it will be out eventually. As for the men who were hardcore holdouts of Sclerus, they managed to fight on until they were offered amnesty and accepted in 980. That being said, Charcianon was effectively the end of the revolt, and it meant that Phocas had fulfilled his duty in crushing the rebellion and upholding the reign of Basil II. In theory, after the crushing of Sclerus' revolt in 979, all was well in the Byzantine world. Bardas Phocas, however, was the Domesticus of the East, which meant that someone who was probably not very reliable was the most powerful general in the Byzantine realm. This was not ideal, but there was little that the court could do about it. After all, Bardas Phocas had helped them to deal with the problem of Sclerus' revolt, and it would be ungrateful to get rid of him at this point. Not to mention that he had a great deal of support from the Byzantine military aristocracy, who would very likely not take his removal lying down. At Constantinople, Basil Lecapenus was still directing affairs, and young Basil II was a young and hands-off emperor. We see here that there are some obvious echoes of the reign of Romanus II, where he had a eunuch running Constantinople and a Phocas commanding in the east virtually on his own. However, there were also some signs which were encouraging. In the east, during this 3-year civil war, there are very few, if any, opportunistic actions taken by Aleppo, the Buyids, or the Fatimids to capitalize on Byzantine distraction. This means that the various emirates are rather weak and unable to really pose a major challenge to the Byzantines on the frontier. There is a difference of policy, however. It appears that Basil Lecapenus did not seem to have envisioned any grand campaigns in the east, whereas Bardas Phocas the Younger thought that he should continue his late uncle's work and further extend Byzantine holdings in the east. Part of the reason why Lecapenus was opposed to these campaigns was probably, one, the expense, but more importantly, he didn't want to give Phocas any more opportunities to empower himself and potentially use success against the Arab world as a springboard for an attempt on the throne. Meanwhile, back in Constantinople, fault lines were beginning to form between Basil II and his great uncle. Basil II was slowly beginning to gain confidence in his judgment and ability to govern the empire, and slowly but surely he was becoming more active in affairs, attending meetings with his great uncle, and also beginning to try to assert himself independently. In Bulgaria, to the northwest of the Byzantine world, developments were occurring which would go on to have a massive impact on the career of Basil II. During the time of John Zimisces, the Byzantines had dissolved the Bulgarian Empire and annexed large portions of it, including the core provinces of eastern Bulgaria. However, the Byzantines had never fully established their authority in the west, and it was here that a new Bulgarian state was born under the leadership of the sons of a count named Nicola. There were 4 of these sons, but the youngest son, Samuel, was by far the most important. As this state began to grow and probably launch some raids, it appears that the sons of the last Tsar were either able to escape from Constantinople, or else they were intentionally released with the hope that they would sow dissent and challenge Samuel and his brothers. In the event, however, the sons of the last Tsar were castrated and therefore unable to really carry on the family name, so they actually were looking to work with these new upstarts rather than against them. Of the 2 last sons of the Bulgarian Tsar, Boris II was killed by Bulgarian border guards because he was dressed in Byzantine garb and mistaken for an enemy. Roman, however, was able to return home and assume the throne, which he officially held for 20 years from 977 to 997. However, even though he was officially the Tsar of Bulgaria, all of the actual power lay with Samuel. Samuel was the effective ruler of Bulgaria from at least 977, and he made it official in 997 when he declared himself Tsar and the heir of the deceased Roman. Samuel of Bulgaria is without a doubt the greatest rival that Basil II ever faced, and he is also one of the most formidable men ever produced by the Bulgarian Empire. So every great figure in history needs a great rival, and Basil now had his great rival, although it would probably take him several years to figure that out. The next few years were relatively quiet. All of our sources, both Byzantine and foreign, all show Basil Lecapenus as running the show in theory and in fact from 979 to 985, with increasing resistance from the young emperor, but it was clear that when you visited Constantinople and you needed to get something done, you had to approach Basil Lecapenus. Bardas Phocas also no doubt had a great deal of influence, as did anyone who served as domesticus of the East, and he was always consulted when it came to foreign policy. Bardas Phocas's main task during this time was to check the ambitions of David III of Tau, while also making sure that the shared border in Syria, where the Byzantine world connected with Aleppo, the Fatimids, and the Buyids, was secure. The real action during this time took place in Italy, the appendage of the Byzantine world. In Italy, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto II, who had been an in-law of Zimisces, campaigned in southern Italy, ostensibly trying to drive out the Arabs, but he ended up spending more of his time on the campaign fighting against the Byzantines. Ultimately, however, when he did shift his attention to the Arabs, they were ready, and in late 982 he suffered a heavy defeat at the hands of the Arab forces there. He could not resume his campaign in South Italy because he was distracted by a Slavic revolt in the east, and he was at Rome planning the response for that when he suddenly died early the next year. After Otto II's death and his unfortunate experience in Italy, the empire's leadership was not very interested in further Italian adventures, and this meant that there was now peace in Italy, at least from the Byzantine perspective. Their holdings were safe. While the military scene of the early 980s was rather boring, the diplomatic scene was anything but. The problem of Bardas Skleras was keeping diplomats awake at night and causing embassies to shuffle back and forth between Constantinople, Baghdad, and other imperial centers. The central concern for the Byzantines was that their opponents, the Buyids, would release Bardas Skleras and his revolt would pick up where it had left off and throw their world into chaos once again. Skleras had proved himself to be a very cagey opponent and someone who was an existential threat, at least in theory. They were therefore willing to consider some pretty major concessions geographically and monetarily in order to secure Sclerus's person and ensure that he couldn't cause any more mischief. Also at this time, the Byzantine court, the Fatimids, and the Buyids of northern Mesopotamia all were in agreement that none of them wanted an all-out war. So this meant that diplomacy was the first and second option for all three of the major factions involved. Bardas Phocas the Younger, for his part, was not happy with this, as he felt like Byzantium was in a better place than its rivals to pursue this war, and he thought that they could further extend their territory and also get everything they wanted. He also, of course, thought this was a great opportunity for him to gain personal glory, so his motives were far from selfless in this, but it's also understandable from his perspective as Domesticus of the East that he was looking for a campaign. While all of this was going on, Aleppo had quietly ceased paying their tribute during the time of Sclerus's revolt, and Phocas marched on Aleppo to make sure that the tribute began to flow once more. One of the key figures in these negotiations was the Buyid envoy Ibn Shakram, who went to Constantinople, but along the way happened to meet with Phocas, the Domesticus of the East, and he quickly perceived that while the court might not want war, Phocas himself was openly advocating for war and even told the ambassador as much. Armed with this knowledge, the ambassador Ibn Shakram went to Constantinople in order to try to achieve his goal of winning territorial concessions in exchange for one Bardas Sclerus. Over the winter of 981 to 982, Ibn Shakram was in Constantinople, and he met with both the Emperor Basil II and Basil Lecapenus. Negotiations were going okay, but they picked up steam when Lecapenus got sick and could no longer attend the meetings. Ibn Shakram was then able to appeal directly to the young emperor's interest by pointing out that by avoiding war, he would establish the primacy of his will against that of his generals, particularly that of Bardas Phocas the Younger. He had detected that there was some friction between the court and this particular general, so he knew exactly where to drive a wedge. It's also likely that Basil II was looking for just such an opportunity, as he was not a big fan of other people having their own will or having the ability to set an agenda without his permission. There was also another person at court at the time, the Byzantine diplomat Nicephorus Orranus, who agreed with his Buyid counterpart and helped persuade Basil II to cut a deal. When he recovered, Lecapenus was furious to learn that his grandnephew had gone behind his back and signed such an important diplomatic agreement. And when we look at the text of this thing, it's not hard to see why Lecapenus was so incensed. This was, on paper, an absolutely absurd deal. Orranus went to Baghdad, and he offered up the revenues of Aleppo to the Buyids, along with all Muslim POWs in Byzantine territory, in exchange for the gradual release of the Scleroi. The deal was finalized in 983, but never fulfilled. Of course, most likely Basil II had no intention of ever fulfilling these obligations, since they were pretty one-sided, but it's unclear exactly why he agreed to this in the first place, unless it was just to try to get one over both on Lecapenus and against Phocas. So this is an early example of the emperor asserting himself, but it appears that as soon as he recovered from illness, Lecapenus was able to clamp down and reassert his control over the state. Basil II, however, as he had proved many times, was quite resilient and determined, and he kept pressing forward, trying to assert his will in the state. Ever since their arrival in Syria, the Fatimids had been largely quiet in the area, since this was not the focus of their strength. It was merely an outlying area. However, in the early to mid-980s, they suddenly became active and relatively aggressive. The Fatimid general Bakjur managed to capture the important city of Damascus in 983, and then used that as a springboard to attack Aleppo in September, initiating a siege on the 12th. Aleppo was independent, but at this time it was a protectorate of Byzantium, due to a recent treaty where Phocas had forced Aleppo to resume paying tribute. Perhaps to the surprise of the Aleppans, Phocas actually arrived the day after the siege began, and he lifted the siege by scaring off the Fatimid army. He then, before departing, extracted 2 years' worth of tribute from the Aleppans, and then went after the Fatimid force. When he reached Bakjor's base at Holmes on October 30th, 983, he captured and then burned the city to the ground. Despite his failure, Bakjor became the governor of Damascus, and he would remain in power until 988. The Fatimids, for their part, would stay quiet for over a year before resuming hostility, although once again they would meet with defeat, and after that they would be quiet for a longer period. 985 was a key turning point in Basil's career. It was in this year when he decided to dismiss his uncle Basil Lecapenus from all offices and take over direct management of the state himself. A little later on, suspecting that Lecapenus was plotting against him, Basil had him arrested and confiscated all of his lands. Pacellus gives a pretty sympathetic account of Lecapenus's plight, talking about all the great services he had rendered and how heartbroken and humiliated he was by the denunciations coming from the emperor. Heartbroken and humiliated, Lecapenus died at around the age of 60, later in the year 985. At age 27, Basil II was now fully in command of the Byzantine world. From here on out, all of the actions taken by the capital will come through Basil II rather than through his chief advisor. Now that he was the sole authority in the Byzantine world, it is likely that Basil must have reached some kind of an agreement with his younger brother Constantine VIII. In our sources, Constantine VIII is largely portrayed as someone who was simply content to hang around court, drink, womanize, and have fun. However, there is another incident that we'll get to toward the end of this video where Constantine VIII, as a man in his late 20s, was valiant, brave, and fought by his brother's side with great distinction. This means that Constantine VIII was not without energy, and surely had some interest in the conduct of government at least at one point in his life. This leads me to believe that there must have been some kind of an arrangement between the two brothers where Basil took on certain functions of the state and left other things to his brother Constantine. My theory here, my hypothesis I should say, since I can't really test it, is that Basil wanted full control of the administrative apparatus of the state and the military, and in exchange, Constantine could control the court, and it would be his children who would one day take over the throne, whereas Basil would remain unmarried and therefore not a threat to Constantine's children. I think this might be behind Basil's decision not to marry. Perhaps he thought this was the best way to ensure a peaceful succession to the throne going forward. In the event, of course, Constantine VIII did not have any sons. He had 3 daughters. But had this been the arrangement, and then had Constantine VIII been lucky enough to have sons, perhaps it would have really been quite a good arrangement. As it stands, we don't really know the exact relationship or if there was any kind of deal, but this is why I think Basil did not marry or have children, is simply because he was counting on his brother to contribute a male heir, and that, of course, never happened, and Basil himself never got around to it either. That being said, yeah, that's my sort of take on it. I believe also that Constantine was willing to accept such a deal because he knew that with Basil's domineering personality and unwillingness to listen to advice at times, that there was no chance of any kind of real partnership in government. Perhaps that's why he poured himself into a life of courtly pleasure, so that way he would never have to run into his brother and butt heads, something which could be both unpleasant and potentially fatal. Shortly after Basil II ousted Basil Lecapenus and began to issue orders in his own name, the Emir of Aleppo, Abu al-Ma'ali, decided to cease paying tribute to the Byzantine world and entered into revolt. Shortly thereafter, Bardas Phocas, who was still the Domesticus of the East, arrived, and he was bent on reducing Aleppo to tribute-paying status once more. First, he seized a fort to the north of Aleppo in July, and then he moved on to besiege the city of Apamea. This city would require the use of heavy equipment, so he settled down for a siege with his catapults and other machines. This gave just enough space for the emir to retaliate by attacking a monastery, killing a number of monks. Phocas then decided to retaliate in turn and inflicted reprisals against various Islamic sites until Basil II dispatched orders for him to change his conduct of the campaign, especially ordering him to break off the siege at Apamea. This was relatively unprecedented, not since the time of Nicephorus II, who was himself a superlative soldier, had an emperor given such explicit orders or intervened so directly in a campaign. For Basil II, a man of no military experience at this time, to engage in such heavy-handed behavior was an insult to the professionalism of Bardas Phocas, and no doubt did not sit well with either Phocas or any of his officers. Meanwhile, the Fatimids decided to capitalize on Byzantine distraction by seizing a coastal fort at Balanius. This would lead Basil to launch a retaliatory operation in that direction as well. At Balanius, we get another example of Basil's high-handed method of leadership. Bardas Phocas remained in Aleppo, no doubt with detailed written instructions of what the emperor expected. Meanwhile, Basil entrusted the war against the Fatimids to the newly appointed dukes of Antioch, Leo Melicinus. Melicinus had an initial attack on the city, which failed. At that point, he was probably settling down for a siege when Basil sent him a direct message saying that if he did not recapture the city, then he would be forced to pay for the entire expense of the campaign out of his own pocket. Although Melicinus was undoubtedly part of the military aristocracy and a wealthy man, this could still be an absolutely ruinous expense if it were imposed upon him, so he had a lot of incentive to succeed, and he pulled it off. His second assault prevailed, and the city of Balanius was returned to the Byzantine orbit. The Fatimids, for their part, don't seem to have fought very hard to hold this new acquisition. In 976, Basil II had been an adult when he watched his great-uncle reshuffle the command deck in the hope of getting rid of problematic generals. However, he repeated the same mistake and with the same lack of subtlety in 985. His priorities were, one, to remove allies of Bardas Phocas from positions of power, and also to remove people who had supported his great-uncle Basil Lecapenus from positions of influence as well. So he saw his enemies as twofold: the enemies within and the enemies without. As for Bardas Phocas himself, Basil gave him the office of Dukes of Antioch. This was an unmistakable demotion from the office of Domesticus of the East. To be frank, Dukes of Antioch was much more in line with Phocas's military talents than Domesticus of the East, but given Phocas's social standing and popularity with the army, this was playing with fire. The soldier poet John Geometres, who had been an admirer of the late Nicephorus II and also Basil Lecapenus, was obviously someone whom Basil II did not trust, so he was cashiered completely in the year 985. Geometres would write a couple of poems later which show a good deal of bitterness, and while he doesn't quite directly name Basil II, it's clear who he doesn't like. The successful Catapano of Italy, Delphinus, who had defeated or at least withstood the attacks of Otto II, was recalled, as was Leo Melicinus, since both of them were Lecapenus guys. Both of them later allied themselves with Phocas when Phocas decided to revolt a year later. Basil knew that shuffling the deck was not enough to keep Phocas in line, so he did learn at least one lesson from 976. He knew that the other step was to acquire his own military glory, so that way the army would think that they didn't need a high-placed Phocas general when they had an emperor of the Macedonian dynasty who was himself a great general and leader of men. Therefore, Basil decided to conduct a campaign in person against the Bulgarians. Basil II's government had been aware of Samuel's growing Bulgarian state for at least 10 years by the time that Basil decided to do something about it. Most likely, Samuel's new Bulgarian state was mostly limited to the western portions of the country, although given the relative inactivity on the part of Byzantine armies at this time, and the temporary withdrawal of some Byzantine forces to fight against Sclerus, it's likely that Samuel had made some inroads into eastern Bulgaria. We know that he had been strong enough to raid across the Danube into Thessaly and Greece in the early 980s. It appears that Basil II's expedition was an escalation of the conflict to a new level, designed to deter further aggression and strike a hard blow against Samuel's incipient state, hopefully preserving the Byzantine hold on eastern Bulgaria. The campaign was directed at the functioning capital of the time, Serdica, today's Sofia. Basil II does not seem to have thought out this campaign very well. He marched in force to the city of Serdica, and he laid siege for only 20 days before it became clear the city was too strong to take by assault and was too well provisioned to fall easily to a siege. It seems quite likely that Basil had underestimated the strength of both Samuel and his new empire. Returning to the south through Trajan's Gate, Basil was taken by surprise by a well-prepared Bulgarian army in ambush on August 16, 986. This battle was a disaster bordering on a catastrophe. Basil barely escaped with his life, losing most of his men, the imperial tent, and his supply train. It was probably in the aftermath of this disaster, which effectively wiped out the Western army for a period of time, when Samuel was finally able to recapture eastern Bulgaria and also capture the city of Larissa in Thessaly, which was one of his most prized acquisitions in terms of taking over cities in Byzantine territory. Trajan's Gate made Basil II look incompetent and weak at a key moment in his career. At this time, the military aristocracy was looking for a good excuse to revolt, and Basil had just given them one by showing that he was not really worthy of his office. John Geometres, who was still bitter about his dismissal, wrote a poem calling for Nicephorus Phocas to rise from his grave and smite the Bulgarians. This was a not-so-subtle hint that he wanted Bardas Phocas to become emperor in order to safeguard the empire. More to the point, there was a class conflict at play. The Macedonian dynasty typically tried to support the peasant class against the aristocracy. A strong aristocracy was always a threat to the monarchy, as seen in the usurpations of Romanus I, Nicephorus II, and John I. The military aristocracy, for its part, wanted to make sure that the state was not intervening in land policy too much. They felt entitled to grow their estates as big as they could because of the amount of time and effort they expended defending the state as officers in the army. On the other hand, common farmers needed a certain amount of land to be able to afford their arms and armor. So there was a balance that the emperors had to maintain. By and large, the Macedonian dynasty tended to side with the peasants over the aristocrats, both for military and political reasons. Whenever possible, of course, the Anatolian military aristocracy would look for an excuse to try to force the court into accepting their desired land policies, because they benefited from this financially. News of this defeat was also discussed outside of the Byzantine world. It reached Baghdad. Here, Bardas Sclerus was residing after the failure to carry out the agreed-upon exchange from a few years ago. Sclerus entered into negotiations with the Buyids, and he was released in December of 986 on the condition that when he took over power, he would adhere to the terms of the 983 treaty, which is to say he would give over border forts and return all Muslim POWs. This was a great deal for the Buyids, who were now playing with house money. They did lend money and troops to Sclerus, but most likely their real hope was that Basil would see the weakness of his position and say, if you're willing to betray Sclerus and kill him, I will fulfill those treaty terms myself. Just spare me the trouble of dealing with Sclerus again. But, of course, this is not quite how this played out, as we'll see, and as bad as things looked right now, they were just about to get worse. Sclerus seemed determined to repeat the actions that he had undertaken 10 years before. When he reached Melitene in February of 987, he declared himself emperor and gained the support of the local governor, and also made an alliance with an outside Muslim dynasty. So literally the same moves he had made before, and in the same place. Basil II was alarmed by Sclerus' return, so he decided to reappoint Phocas as domesticus. However, Phocas traveled to a site familiar to him, Charcianon, and in August or September declared himself emperor at Melinus' estate at Charcianon. It would appear that both usurpers were quite taken by the symbology of their own careers. Sclerus and Phocas then decided to broker an agreement between themselves whereby Phocas would be the senior partner, but Sclerus would be included and get to govern part of the empire. Sclerus seems to have trusted Phocas, and he traveled to meet with him, but Phocas betrayed him and had him imprisoned at Tyropoion. Effectively, Sclerus had gone from prison in Baghdad and then marched to a new prison in Anatolia. Not a great deal for him, but for Phocas he had eliminated a potentially dangerous rival, and he was now the primary challenger to the throne. I've represented Phocas here with Lu Bu from Dynasty Warriors, because Lu Bu was a formidable force in a one-on-one fight, just like Bardas Phocas, although he was not necessarily a very good general beyond his ability to use a spear himself. Unlike Sclerus' revolt in 976, the 987 revolt of Phocas was much more effective in terms of getting all of the military aristocracy to go along with it. Pretty much the entire army in the east, with a handful of exceptions, defected to Phocas, so he was a rebel, but an extremely powerful one. Half of his force went to Chrysopolis and awaited ships, while Phocas himself went to Abydos and tried to besiege that city. From 987 to 989, this is where he was, trying to capture the city, but never with any success. Basil, for his part, was able to circumvent Phocas' control of the usual grain shipments by using his naval superiority to sail as far afield as Trebizond to purchase grain. So the city did not starve, although most likely prices went up, or there were a few days where there might not have been grain available. Basil had managed to use his fleet to ride out this crisis, however. In 987, the major problem facing Basil was not his fleet, which was still intact and loyal, but rather a manpower issue. The Western army had been devastated by Trajan's Gate and was still rebuilding, and he also needed an army with which he could use to fight the usurper Phocas. So the only place he could turn was to diplomacy in order to get a foreign ruler to give him troops who could really help him win this war. He decided, in a moment of inspiration, to turn to the Kievan Rus for help. Basil sent envoys to Vladimir, the new ruler of Kiev after the death of Svyatoslav. Svyatoslav, for those of you who remember my video on Zemskis, was the Rus leader who had invaded Bulgaria only to be expelled by Zemskis and then murdered by the Pechenegs. Basil offered his sister's hand in marriage, Anna Porphyrogenita, in exchange for Vladimir agreeing to convert to Christianity and sending along several thousand Varangian troops. For Vladimir, this was a diplomatic coup. He gained just as much from this as Basil did. Vladimir would gain international standing with his Christian neighbors, and also a great deal of prestige by being the first foreign ruler to successfully net a born-in-the-purple princess of the Macedonian dynasty, a feat which neither the Holy Roman Empire nor the Bulgarians had accomplished. Even Charlemagne was denied this honor. In return, Basil received 6,000 Varangians who arrived either in the spring or summer of 988. For both sides, this was a winning deal, and it's actually surprising that it took this long for the Byzantines to agree to marry off a born-in-the-purple princess in exchange for some huge diplomatic favors. Basil cashed in his cards quite well on this deal, however, as he very much needed the Varangians, and that group would emerge as the key component of his army for the rest of his career. So if anything, while both sides won this negotiation, Basil probably won just a little bit more. Soon after his Varangian troops arrived, Basil decided to strike the divided enemy force in Asia, utilizing his naval superiority and the mobility that it gave him. Luckily for Basil, the enemy was divided between Chrysopolis and Abydos. Basil's general Teranides, in the meanwhile, this is probably the son of Asat III, who had given his holdings to Nicephorus II in 968 in exchange for standing at the court for his sons, landed in Trebizond, recruited troops, and marched forthwith to the Euphrates, trying to create a disturbance in the rear of Phocas's territory. However, he was defeated by Phocas's son Nicephorus, who was able to gather aid from the Kartvelians once again. Moving on Chrysopolis, Basil was able to catch Delphinus by surprise, and when he captured the former Catapano of Italy, he had him hanged. The news of this defeat and the fate of Delphinus was enough to cause the Caucasian soldiers with Phocas serving at Abydos to go home on the grounds that they had fulfilled their obligation to serve. Once again, we have to keep in mind that the bar for success in a civil war for a legitimate emperor was much lower than that of a usurper. Usurpers had to be successful all the way until they won the whole shebang, whereas legitimate emperors could afford some setbacks and then mount a comeback. For Phocas, things were now becoming pretty dicey, whereas Basil had very much evened the odds and taken away Phocas's major advantage. However, the civil war was far from over, and Phocas still controlled more of the empire than Basil II. Phocas decided to double down on the siege at Abydos, but he was unable to capture that city. He must have been coming close because Basil mounted a relief expedition. This expedition was an all-out endeavor and included both of the emperors. Basil II and Constantine VIII attended this fight in person, and both of them were decked out in full armor. Our sources say that Constantine VIII looked especially impressive at this battle, carrying a long spear and apparently being quite graceful and skilled with that weapon. The two armies arrayed against one another, and Phocas, who was one of the foremost fighters in the empire on an individual level despite being well into middle age by this point, tried to challenge Basil to individual combat to decide the fate of the empire. Basil declined. Phocas had been feeling ill all day, and there were some later rumors recorded in Pacellus that he may have been poisoned by a supporter of Basil. At any rate, what it sounds like based on the nausea and the tiredness that he was experiencing before going into battle and then dropping dead, sounds to me more like a heart attack than anything else, but it's hard to say. At the time, people suspected poison. Phocas had not been feeling well all day, but he knew that his path to victory lay in taking out the emperor and showing his personal valor. Therefore, he was leading a charge directly against the imperial center, but along the way, he dropped dead, fell from his horse, and after that, his army was demoralized and easily swept away by Basil's Varangians. Bardas's son Leo surrendered Antioch toward the end of the year 989, and with that surrender, the Phocades were broken for a generation. As I mentioned earlier, they were not broken forever, as Basil would give one of Bardas Phocas' sons an appointment as late as 1022, yet this did do a great deal of standing to the Phocas family, and they would never again be nearly so powerful going forward. For whatever reason, when I picture Bardas Sclerus in my mind, Brynden Tully the Blackfish from Game of Thrones comes to mind. Once Phocas was dead, Sclerus was released from prison, and then many of Phocas's former followers decided to sign up with Sclerus. For his part, Sclerus was not very active during these months, despite the claims of Pacellus, who claims that he was evading Basil and building up a following. At any rate, Sclerus' reputation was great enough that Basil was eager to settle with him rather than trying to decide things in battle, and Sclerus was then able to negotiate his surrender and retirement. By this point in his career, he was too old to really mount an effective challenge to Basil. Remember, he had just basically given up to Phocas just a few years before and agreed to be second fiddle, and then traveled trustingly to visit one of Phocas's strongholds. Sclerus, for his part, though, was still sharp enough to make sure that Basil granted amnesty to all of his men. This was fairly standard, but by this point Basil already had a well-deserved reputation for being a bit more harsh than the average emperor, so Sclerus getting this concession was pretty smart. Sclerus by this point was about 70. He was old and experiencing eyesight and mobility issues. Later on, when Basil sees him for the first time, he remarks that it's incredible that such an old man who can barely walk and can't see straight was giving him such problems. Before Sclerus officially went into retirement in Thrace, he agreed to meet with Basil in Asia Minor and discuss imperial affairs. This discussion is perhaps the most dramatic part of Pacellus' life of Basil II. Throughout Basil's entire life, Bardas Sclerus had been a distant and imposing figure. During the reign of John Zimisces, when Basil was a teenager, Sclerus was winning major battles. Later, when Basil himself became emperor, Sclerus was embarrassing his generals and threatening his position atop the throne. Later on, he was the boogeyman of Baghdad, and Basil had to deal with high-level negotiations with foreign powers and had to consider giving up territory in order to contain the threat of Sclerus. I imagine that he had a mental image of Sclerus which was out of keeping with the decrepit old man he ended up meeting. He told the people around him that he was amazed by just how old and worn out Sclerus was, yet one can't help but think that Basil knew that Sclerus's brain was an impressive instrument, and he was very eager to pick it. However, Basil was always authoritarian in his mannerisms, and he threw a bit of a fit over protocol when he saw Sclerus wearing imperial slippers. This seems to have just been a mistake by an old man who doesn't see very well, but Basil's eyes were sharp and he saw these from a distance and refused to allow Sclerus to be admitted to his presence until this violation of protocol had been fixed. We have to keep in mind that Basil's grandfather Constantine VII had written at length on court protocol, and this is probably something that Basil was interested in himself, since he was always concerned with maintaining his dignity in front of others. Sclerus switched shoes, and then they met. Sclerus was apparently afraid of young Basil because he knew that Basil had a temper, and he waited for Basil to drink from the wine container first before he took a drink to make sure it wasn't poisoned. After they'd established some familiarity and an apparently mundane conversation with one another, they then got down to brass tacks. Sclerus, of course, gave some excuses for why he revolted. Basil pretended that this was all fine and well and all was forgiven, and then he asked Sclerus point blank What do I need to do to successfully hold on to the empire and prevent people like you from revolting in the future? Sclerus supposedly gave him a piece of candid and accurate advice contrary to his own class interest. He said, "Cut down the governors who become overproud. Let no generals on campaign have too many resources. Exhaust them with unjust exactions to keep them busied with their own affairs. Admit no woman to the imperial councils. Be accessible to no one. Share with few your most intimate plans." Pacellus implies that these thoughts had not fully occurred to Basil before this point, but I can't help but feel that this is more or less a description of what Basil was already doing, and also that this was completely in line with Basil's personality. So if Sclerus did indeed say this, then perhaps he was just trying to kiss ass and played a confirmation bias to make sure that Basil would leave him alone during his retirement years. At any rate, this was the advice that Basil followed, and whether or not Sclerus helped to solidify him in this practice, certainly this was the way that Basil ran the empire from 989 forward, but I would argue probably he had been doing this from at least 985. At any rate, this was how Pacellus really illuminated Basil's method of ruling, and also more or less shows us the source of the conflict between Basil and the military aristocracy, since Basil was explicitly trying to suppress them in order to elevate himself. In early 989, at about the same time that Basil was preparing for his final showdown with Bardas Phocas the Younger, Vladimir, his good ally, decided to seize the port city of Cherson in the Crimea as insurance in case Basil, once relieved of the burden of fighting usurpers, reneged on the marriage alliance. After all, the prejudice of the Byzantines toward their barbarian neighbors was well known, and had Basil managed to succeed rapidly with his Varangians and defeat the threats near him, it is unlikely that he would have gone through with the agreement. By seizing Cherson, Vladimir had collateral, and this apparently was effective, and it made sure that Basil fulfilled his obligation. Basil's sister Anna was very much opposed to this match and had nightmares about what she would encounter once she reached the land of the Rus. She was accompanied by a large number of priests who would both conduct the ceremony of marriage between herself and Vladimir and also convert the population. Up to this point, Vladimir had been polygamous, and there were all kinds of rumors about his sexual depravity, so Anna thought that she was in for a very rough life. However, after his conversion, Vladimir became monogamous, and he proved to be a pretty good husband to Anna, who probably didn't live quite happily ever after, but at least was not completely miserable either. In retrospect, Vladimir's conversion was one of the key events in Russia's cultural history, and of course, since this wedding took place in the Ukraine, it was also hugely influential on Ukrainian history. There are monuments to Vladimir in both Ukraine and Russia, and even a couple in Poland as well, if I'm not mistaken. So Vladimir, through his act of becoming Christian, became a saint, and also became a major cultural icon throughout many countries in Eastern Europe. By 989, the now 31-year-old Basil II had become the Basil II known to history rather than the inexperienced young emperor struggling to compete with more experienced men and struggling even to make his voice heard at his own court. His early career, rather than his natural disposition, may account for a good deal of his autocratic behavior and his reputation for arrogance in the sources. We also have to consider that the military aristocracy had a dominant cultural influence, and because they felt somewhat abused by his land policies, perhaps they regarded him as more arrogant than he actually was. That being said, he did see a lot of advantage in being distant. It also was influenced by the fact that he is not super charismatic, so the less direct exposure he has to people, the less likely he is to expose some of his shortcomings. Basil, I think we can safely say, was not a genius, militarily or otherwise. However, he did have a pragmatic mind, and he knew what his strengths and weaknesses were. By this point in his career, he had acquired something which would help him compensate for his lack of military genius, the Varangian Guard. This elite and loyal shock unit would enable him to get himself out of a good deal of trouble in the future, and the Varangians would feature prominently in nearly all of his subsequent victories. He was also beginning to really grasp strategy. We see that he had a good strategy against Bardas Phocas, and he did improve over time. One thing that Basil never really figured out, at least not by this point in his career, is he never really built up a reliable corps of senior officers whom he trusted implicitly. He would become very close with the soldiers themselves, and he would be very generous to war orphans, but he never quite was able to really trust subordinates with a great deal of authority and autonomy due to his early experiences as a child and as a young emperor. This means that for the remaining 35 years of his reign in life, he will undertake the burden of pretty much all of his major campaigns by himself. Hopefully it's clear to everyone by this point that while Basil did go on to achieve great things, he was not necessarily someone bound to be great. He was great because he forced himself to be that. He had an indomitable will, and he ended up being more than the sum of his parts. There's no individual part of Basil II which was superlatively skilled, but he was average or above average at basically everything, and combining that with his will and his born in the purple status and the confidence that that gave him, it was enough to propel him to the ranks of the greatest rulers in all of history. Going forward, I plan to do a few more lives of men who lived at the same time as Basil before finishing up Basil's life. I want to look at Bardas Sclerus, Bardas Phocas, and Basil Lecapenus. So if you want to see those videos, look at my Romans of Renown series, and those will be forthcoming within the next several weeks. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian. Having dealt with the rebels Sclerus and Phocas, Basil II was securely installed as emperor by 989. However, he still had scores to settle and foreign foes to conquer. During the remaining 36 years of his life and reign, Basil engaged in unceasing activity. As a result, Basil's career is even more complex than its sheer chronological length would seem to suggest. As a result, I have decided to divide my treatment of his life into portions defined by time period and geography. This episode will focus on Basil's activities in the East from 989 to 1002. Although Basil began his Bulgarian War in 991, and this was his consuming passion until 1018, Basil and his generals were also active and mostly successful in the East. Additionally, since Basil published his land laws on the heels of an eastern expedition, I will cover Basil's land laws and their implications here. My current plan is to cover the war against Bulgaria in the next two videos, and then conclude with the video on Basil's last years. Michael Pacellus was a child when Basil died. However, he was one of the most important historians of Basil's reign due to his role at court as an imperial tutor in the decades following Basil's death. Pacellus has accordingly had a great deal of influence on how we view Basil. And unfortunately, as some modern Byzantine scholars such as Catherine Holmes and Anthony Caldelis have pointed out, we do need to be very cautious when handling Pacellus' account because he was a rhetorician, a moralist, and someone who was operating in a courtly environment who was not really free to engage in what we might think of today as history. Pacellus' work in many ways is an exhortation. He wants to convince his followers, or at least his audience, that they too can be like Basil. What he tries to do is normalize and sort of make mundane the achievements of Basil by trying to reduce Basil from an extraordinary man who achieved some godlike military successes to just a guy who was of absolutely normal ability, but who worked extraordinarily hard and therefore achieved extraordinary results. In other words, he was trying to tell the emperors of his own time to get off their lazy asses and go out and command armies. And the idea is if they just work hard enough, that they can replicate the success that Basil had, because Basil was just detail-oriented, methodical, and didn't really have any particular talent. He just worked really hard. And there are reasons to question this portrait. For instance, Pacellus has Basil as this kind of slow, plodding general who moved slowly but inexorably towards his objectives, but didn't really have a ton of actual skill. But we know that Basil actually could and did move extremely quickly. And if you look at all of the great generals in history, most of them, or at least all of them I can think of, can move as quickly or more quickly than their contemporaries. Speed is very important in military affairs. He often trusted subordinates with major responsibilities, unlike what Pacellus has to say, which is that Basil always commanded in person. We know, for instance, that he left the East in the hands of Nicephorus Uranus, and that he also employed Uranus in Europe at various times as well when he needed backup fighting Samuel and the Bulgarians. He also had other subordinates, but he tended to go with the people he trusted the most, and he liked to have his proven commanders on standby. Pacellus also claims that Basil preferred rough men of no learning over aristocrats who are refined. But we know that while Basil did promote some newcomers to the game, he also did work with a great number of aristocrats as well. He was just very selective about who he worked with. He had to personally trust someone, and that was probably a result of his early experiences having to deal with Phocas and Sclerus. That being said, he really didn't govern that differently than other emperors, and while he did fight in person, this does not mean that in an empire as large as his, he could afford to command every battle. As we'll see, there are plenty of important battles that occurred during his reign where he wasn't within 1,000 miles. So, with all of that in mind, let's proceed forward to 989 and talk about Basil's operations in the east. While Basil was busy fighting the usurpers Sclerus and Phocas, David of Tau, third of his name, was trying to set up a larger empire in the Caucasus for himself and his family. Without issue himself, David chose his cousin Bagrat as the king of the neighboring kingdom of Abkhazia, and then adopted him as the heir of Upper Tau, so that upon his own death the two realms would unify and there would be a Caucasian empire under Bagrat. However, this was not to be, as Basil did not want to have a strong Armenian kingdom to his northeast. In general, the Byzantines were interested in decently sized buffer states, but ones which were not large enough to constitute any kind of potential threat. Basil therefore started a war with Upper Tau in late 988 and into 989. David III was forced to surrender. However, Basil was mostly generous in the peace. David received the court title of Curo Pilates, and he also retained Upper Tau for his lifetime. However, and this is a big however, David had to agree to bequeath his kingdom not to his nephew, but rather to the Byzantine Empire upon his death. This is a big deal. Tau is an area approximately the same size as Cilicia. This means that in a short campaign, Basil won a territory the same size as Cilicia, which took Nicephorus Phocas and his family quite a bit longer to conquer through a great deal more campaigns and bloodshed. This was an absolute coup, and it's especially impressive if we consider that Basil effectively just took the army that he had used to defeat his rivals, maybe integrated some of the newly surrendered men, and then just marched against Tau. This was not a planned expedition. There was not a lot of planning or effort that went into this compared with most campaigns. So this was almost free money. Despite having many opportunities in the east due to weak enemies, Basil was intent upon finishing Zemsky's project of subjugating and integrating Bulgaria into the empire. After he returned from the east in 989, Basil would spend the next 2 years in the capital preparing for his Bulgarian war. It is possible that had events not intervened, he might have only needed a single season to prepare himself for the Bulgarian war, but as things worked out, it ended up taking a little longer. The reason is that on the night of October 25, 989, there was a huge earthquake which struck Constantinople and did a great deal of damage to many of the city's buildings. The most notable damage occurred at the Hagia Sophia itself, the city's most iconic building, where the dome and arches were damaged. This would take 4 to 6 years to repair, and it was obviously something which demanded some of Basil's attention. All of the sources for Basil's eastern campaigns explicitly state that Basil's priority was always Bulgaria. These sources here would all mention that Basil might come to the east, but they would say that he was always in a hurry to get back to Bulgaria, or that he was hesitant to leave Bulgaria for the east. So even while we're talking about what Basil does in the east, keep in mind that his mind is always in Bulgaria. To fully appreciate the importance of Basil's eastern operations, we need to consider their place in his overall strategy. His number one priority at all times was Bulgaria. However, this does not mean that he neglected the east by any stretch of the imagination. Basil himself always retained the Varangian Guard. This unit was about 6,000 strong, and it was a corps personally loyal to him. It is also possible that in order to have overwhelming force against Samuel and the Bulgarians, that Basil may have removed a few of the field units from the east in order to reinforce the army of the west. Traditionally, Byzantine emperors tended to put most of their forces in the eastern army, as that was where there was the greatest avenue for expansion and opportunity. That being said, as Basil was on a defensive footing in the east, he may have removed a few units in order to not have them waste their time. He also did not appoint a domesticus of the east because he didn't want to empower an aristocrat at the time who he couldn't trust yet, so there was no grand commander in the east. However, this does not necessarily mean that his local commanders were hopelessly outnumbered. Most of the enemies in the east were either weak or somewhat inactive. The one exception, as we'll see, is the Fatimid Caliphate, which had been relatively inactive up until the 990s, and then randomly decided to become aggressive, as we'll see. Basil's policy was effectively to let his generals handle things in the east, and if something were to go awry, if they were to face a major setback, then he would go undo the damage and then hurry back to Europe. When he did go east, Basil went with style, and he went with overwhelming force. His goal was to try to win as quickly as humanly possible, but also win thoroughly, which is why he always came with an army that no one in the east could hope to match. Many scholars say that Basil had 3 eastern campaigns. I think they're wrong. There are 4 campaigns because I count the campaign that Basil waged against David of Tau in 988 to 989. 2 more of his eastern campaigns will basically be the crux of this video, and then the final eastern campaign in the early 1020s I will save for the final video of this series. But despite having a very limited number of campaigns and not spending very much time in the east compared with the time that he spent in Europe, Basil still did accomplish a great deal, as we will see, and not just when he got David to name him as his heir for Upper Tau. In the absence of a domesticus of the east, Basil had to personally approve of the movements of all of his armies, and nothing was really delegated on the strategic level. This means that when one of his vassals, say the Emir of Aleppo, needed reinforcements, he had the first right to Basil. His envoys would have to travel to Bulgaria, find him, then come back and deliver the news to one of his more local generals, in this case the Dukes of Antioch, Michael Bortses. So this was a somewhat clunky arrangement, but it did prevent him from having to appoint a domesticus of the East who might become a potential rival. At this point, The revolt of Phocas and Sclerus was still a little fresh, and Basil was not quite ready to trust anyone with that level of responsibility. He also probably had some doubts about Bortses, despite Bortses' long service and experience, due to Bortses being involved both in the overthrow of Nicephorus Phocas and also being involved in some double dealing during the crisis involving Bardas Phocas and Bardas Sclerus. When the Emir of Aleppo found himself under siege by the Fatimid general Bakjor, he, of course, appealed to his suzerain Basil, and then Basil approved of reinforcements from Antioch, so Bortses led down 6,000 imperial troops. This resulted in a battle in April of 991 near the city of Aleppo, where the Aleppan Byzantine army faced off against Bakjor and the Fatimids. The allied force was successful, Bakjor was captured and executed. The old Emir of Aleppo died early the next year, and he was then succeeded by his less able son Al-Fada'il. This also led to some of the Aleppan officials defecting to the Fatimids, because they thought that this new leader would not really guide them anywhere and would be kind of a problem, a liability. Aleppo, however, would prove to be fine, largely due to Byzantine support, but also due to the wisdom of a new vizier who rose up to prop up this young, weak ruler. Nonetheless, it would be Aleppan weakness, at least the perception of Aleppan weakness, which would really draw the attention of the Fatimids, and they would continue to attack at Aleppo. After Bakjor's death, the Fatimid Caliph Al-Aziz appointed Manju Takin to take his place at Damascus, and despite the advice of one of his own viziers, he insisted that the Fatimid Caliphate's #1 priority should be to capture the Emirate of Aleppo. Manju Takin took up his post in 992 and renewed the war. I presume that he had to bring a substantial number of reinforcements with him from Egypt in order to resume the war so quickly. Manju Takin was able to take the Aleppans by surprise and smash an Aleppan army at Apamea. He then laid siege to Aleppo itself, which led Basil to send orders to Bortses to intervene once again. Manju Takin anticipated Bortses' intervention. After all, it's pretty easy to predict, and given how the Byzantine system works with orders, this means that the Fatimids, after invading, have a certain amount of time where they can operate with virtual impunity before they have to worry about imperial forces arriving on the scene. Manju Takin therefore planned well for Bortses' eventual moves, and he decided to march north to head off Bortses before he could reach Aleppo. Before Bortses could properly deploy his army and march down to help the Aleppans, Manju Takin had abandoned his siege of Aleppo and he had marched north to Antioch itself. Therefore, Bortses found himself thrust on the defensive. Manju Takin had a much larger army and he was laying waste to the Antiochene countryside in the summer of 992. Bortses was outnumbered about 6-1. The sources say that he had 5,000 men in his army as opposed to 30,000 Fatimid soldiers under the command of Manju Takin. We don't know the total size of Bortses' army. Presumably he had some second-line troops holding down the city of Antioch, but in terms of men who were fit to take the field, he had maybe 5,000. Trailing Manju Takin for a while, Bortses eventually decided that he needed to take a stand somewhere where he could really offset his numerical disadvantage. He therefore decided to hold a bridgehead on the Orontes River and let the Fatimids come at him. Despite choosing a strong position and a valid strategy, however, Bortses was defeated and then forced to fall back to Antioch. Manju Takin was now able to leave Antioch at his leisure and attempt a new siege at Aleppo without fear of a Byzantine intervention. With the capital of Syria having its countryside devastated, Bortses would need to reconstitute his army and also worry about keeping his people fed, so he would not be in a great position to try to intervene. However, Manju Takin's efforts at Aleppo were once again not successful, so he retired to winter quarters at Damascus. Basil was probably not terribly thrilled about the events of 992, but he does not seem to have been terribly worried either. At this time, he was involved in a 4-year non-stop campaign against the Bulgarians, and while this was somewhat annoying in the east, this was hardly a catastrophe or a red alert. Manjutakin's assaults continued in 993 and 994, although we don't really know the exact sequence of events in 993 aside from the fact that the Fatimids continued to make progress. By the time 994 rolled around, the Fatimids had secured control of the city of Apamea, installing a garrison, and they were also launching naval raids along the coast of Syria on imperial territory. In the spring of 994, Manjutakin marched to Antioch first in order to lay waste and intimidate Bortses, and only then did he turn south to Aleppo. Basil once again sent orders to Bortses to save Aleppo, and also finally sent reinforcements under the general Leo Melicinus. We don't know exactly who was in charge once Melicinus arrives, but given Bortses' seniority, he had been the Dukes of Antioch since about 969, it seems that Bortses was probably in charge, and I'm going to work on that assumption. The way the sources phrase it, they could have been in co-command, however, or their commands could have been separate. It's not entirely clear. Bortses decided to shadow Manjutakin once again, and he and Melicinus mostly just fought against the foragers. So the idea was not to engage directly, but rather to try to harass Manjutakin and deprive him of needed supplies so that he would be forced to break off the siege. They did not feel comfortable, obviously, trying to fight Manjutakin on equal terms. They simply did not have the manpower. Bortses' strategy of trying to harry Manjutakin and make life miserable for him was a solid one. However, Manjutakin was equally aware of what Bortses was trying to accomplish, and he knew that his best chance for conducting a successful siege was to get rid of the army which was trying to harass him. So accordingly, he lifted the siege at Aleppo and pursued Bortses in order to force him into a battle. On September 15, 994, Manjutakin cornered Bortses and his Byzantine Aleppan army at Apamea. Apamea is not far to the north of Aleppo, and if anything, I think that Apamea was really the center of the conflict between Byzantium and the Fatimid Caliphate throughout this entire period, throughout the 990s. I actually was tempted at one point to name this episode the Apamea episode just because of how many battles take place at Apamea. But I resisted the temptation because I also had to talk about some stuff that happened in Tau. Nonetheless, this battle fought on September 15, 994 proved to be a very hard-fought battle despite the fact that the Fatimids had a massive numerical advantage. The Byzantines especially were said to have fought most valiantly. Nonetheless, the Aleppans eventually broke, and when they broke, the Byzantine line also buckled, and this led to a pursuit, which favored the lighter-armed and faster Fatimid forces. During the pursuit, Bortses lost some 5,000 men, which, if we looked at his earlier numbers before he got reinforced by Melicinus, would constitute basically his whole original field army. The sources don't quite specify how many of the men were Byzantine and how many were Aleppan, but in either case, this was very bad for their chances at holding Aleppo. So Bortses and Melicinus were crippled, and now Manjutakin was able to besiege Aleppo in earnest. He felt so secure after this battle that he was able to remain there over the winter of 994 to 995. It's safe to say that this was a true crisis, and as soon as he heard the news, Basil was convinced that this event required his intervention. Over the course of his 50-year imperial career, Basil II had many stunning successes and did a lot of things which are profoundly impressive. For me personally, however, his epic forced march from Bulgaria to Antioch is the most impressive thing that he accomplished. He did this march in early 995. This is right when he got news of the Battle of Apamea and the crisis facing the Emirate of Aleppo. Basil was deep in the Bulgarian heartland with his army, yet he knew that he needed to personally arrive in the east in order to deliver the Aleppans and contain the Fatimids. Knowing that speed was vital and that the clock was ticking for Aleppo, Basil quickly rounded up all of the horses and mules he could find, mounted every single man in his army, which numbered probably around 30,000 men, and then traveled overland from where he was on campaign in Europe all the way to Antioch. Incredibly, and in an unprecedented fashion, Basil was able to pull this off, including having to transport his men by ship across the Straits of Marmara. He accomplished all of this in under a month. When Basil appeared at Aleppo unannounced, Manjutakin immediately panicked and then bolted for the safety of Damascus, not coming out again until Basil had returned home. So Manjutakin, who himself was a relatively talented and experienced commander, recognized the insanity of what Basil had pulled off, and he was duly impressed by it. This is not the kind of commander who was one to shit his pants, but what Basil accomplished was exactly the kind of thing which was worth shitting one's pants over. With Manjutakin's men beating a retreat, Basil met with the Aleppan emir al-Fada'il, who prostrated himself before Basil. Basil then generously forgave Aleppo its tax burden for the last few years so that it could focus on recovery. For this generosity and also for taking extraordinary measures to reach his vassal, Basil attracted a great deal of praise from Eastern sources, who were especially impressed that a Christian overlord would go to such measures to help a Muslim vassal. Basil then embarked on a mass-scale show of force all around Syria, and he effectively erased all of Manjutakin's gains in a single season of campaigning. One thing he was not successful at, however, was taking the city of Tripolis. He had a month-long siege, and despite having a pro-Byzantine faction inside of the city, it did not fall to his forces. This would also be a pattern of Byzantine operations in Syria, that one city they could never take was Tripolis. He did, however, establish a strong garrison to the north of Tripolis at Antarados. Basil then marched back to Antioch and thence to the capital. But as I alluded to at the outset, his experience in the east was not quite over. When he stopped off at Antioch, Basil knew that he had to make some changes in order to solidify his eastern frontier and make sure that a repeat of the Battle of Apamea did not occur. He was angry with Bortses and held him responsible for the disaster, and therefore had him removed from command and placed under house arrest. It's also possible that he had Bortses arrested and removed prior even to his arrival, but the absolute chronology here is not exactly clear. According to Anthony Caldelis, he thinks that Basil had Bortses effectively sacked for incompetence and for losing an entire campaigning season in Bulgaria. And while I think that there's certainly something to that, I do think that there's a little more going on than just that. Bortses' removal and punishment may have been a delayed punishment for his earlier behavior. And also, it may have served as a weather balloon for his actions against other aristocrats he distrusted, such as Constantine Malienus. Basil, who was not as old or established as Bortses in some ways, maybe just wanted to see what would happen if he removed a senior commander. Just wanted to test the boundaries. And when everyone thought it was acceptable and that his actions made sense, perhaps this is what emboldened him to go forward with his land reforms, which we'll get to in just a moment. As for the new dukes, this was Damianos Dalasinos, who was the first member of his family to rise to a high office. We know that Damianos was at least middle-aged by this time. He has 2 adult sons, so he has a combination of experience and ability. And just as Pacellus sort of hinted at, he was not one of the sort of inner nobility. However, as we'll see, he was a worthy contender. So regardless of how literarily accomplished he was still an excellent choice for the office of dukes at Antioch, and he would prove himself to be worthy of the honor on a few different occasions. While Basil was traveling home with his army, he happened to stop by in Cappadocia, where Constantine Malianos generously offered to feast the entire army at his personal expense. For Basil, this probably showed that there were some families which were simply too powerful. Constantine Malianos, by the way, was the father of someone who had done a great deal to help finance the usurpation of either Sclerus or Phocas. And so Basil would have been especially miffed by this display of great wealth by somebody in the family. Constantine Malianus, by the way, had been retired for a long time. This man was about 90 years old by this point, so he personally didn't pose a real threat, but this family's established wealth certainly did. Basil accordingly decided to act friendly towards the old man and had him escort him back to Constantinople. Then, when he was in Constantinople, he had the old man sign an agreement that he would hand over his land when he died. So basically, this was an upper Tau situation, but on a much smaller scale. Then in January of 996, Basil issued his famous land laws, which lay out a number of provisions designed to protect peasants from being exploited by the Dunatoi, the Byzantine aristocracy, the powerful, and by the church. That creates a lot of controversies that we'll get into. One of the more interesting aspects of Basil's land laws is that he does name specific abusers in the edict, people who have gone beyond what the laws allow, people who are holding land illegally. And one of the people he names is his supposed friend, old man Constantine Malianos. So I think that there is a great deal of evidence just in the way that these edicts are written that there is a personal agenda at play. But let's talk about these land laws and how a few different scholars tend to look at them and look at their significance. One quick note before we get into how particular scholars look at the land laws: there is very little, if any, evidence about how Basil did or did not enforce these laws. So while we can talk about what the laws were, we have no idea to what extent, if any, they were actually ever enforced, or if Basil actually governed in a different way on a meaningful sense than his predecessors and successors. We know that his successors allowed things to get out of control. We don't know if that's because Basil didn't do enough or whether this is because there was a reversal of what Basil tried to do. Most, but not all, of Basil's land laws were passed in early 996. They dealt with issues of land ownership and the transfer of land from one person or institution to another. And while these are not necessarily the most exciting reading, these are things which are at the heart of Byzantine society, and this is very much Basil dealing with central core economic issues in his realm. Because of the way that his laws are written in a strongly moralist tone, where he says that he's defending the small man against the great landlord and that he's standing up for justice against greed, there have been people who have tried to paint Basil as some sort of a class hero for the small farmer against the greed of the military aristocracy, the Dunatoi. But that interpretation has largely fallen out of favor, although it still is around. Tim Gregory, in his textbook by Blackwell, does effectively carry this traditional narrative, although he goes into a great deal of detail and provides some reason to believe that this might actually be the case. He says effectively that defending the small peasant farmers is an important way to keep the military running. The army's backbone had always been peasant farmers, and protecting their lands from predation was an essential thing that you had to do to keep the armies working the way they're supposed to. It was core to the thematic system. Catherine Holmes, who's written a book on Basil as a governor, effectively, how he ran his empire, argues that Basil's main priority was trying to secure his position against the Dunatoi in the wake of the revolts of Sclerus and Phocas, and that he was effectively trying to create weapons he could use in theory against the Dunatoi. So by wording his laws so strongly, he was daring the Dunatoi to cross him. He was also giving himself a legal avenue by which to pursue them if he needed to. This is also around the same time that he declared that all of the laws that were promulgated by Basil Lecapenus, his uncle, were no longer valid, and that land deeds had to go back to at least the time of Romanus I to be valid. Interestingly enough, Romanus I passed similar laws to what Basil passed when it comes to land tenureship, and if anything, some scholars think that Romanus's laws were actually stricter, even if they are a little less dramatic in terms of taking a strong tone. Anthony Caldelis primarily follows Holmes's thinking and says that if we look at Basil's land laws, they're just a handful of laws over a long period of time, and they probably weren't terribly systemic. There certainly is nothing like a class consciousness guiding this effort. He thinks that rather than trying to regulate the Dunatoi by regulating the size of their estates, that Basil's strategy was more or less to regulate them by either granting or depriving them of offices strategically, by making sure that his key followers got the high offices and that the people he couldn't trust were deprived of those offices. He doesn't think that Basil was really stirring the nest by trying to take away lands, even though Pacellus explicitly says that Basil made it his mission in life to deprive people such as the Phocates of their ancestral allotments. And in fact, despite that claim by Pacellus, there are a few sons of Bardas Phocas who later take up office under Basil. So there is some contradiction there. And I think in this case we have to follow the more material evidence as opposed to the claims of the rhetorician Michael Pacellus. When it comes to the truth about Basil's land laws, I myself do not claim to know, so I will leave that to you to decide. Getting back to the main narrative, let's look at the activities of the new dukes of Antioch, Damianos Dalicinos. Basil probably left behind some of his forces since the new dukes was able to take the field in late 995 and continue the offensive. So even after the majority of the Byzantine army was gone, he still had enough force in place to take the initiative. This makes me think that perhaps Basil was deliberately trying to limit the hand of Bortzes, but held a great deal more trust in Bortzes' successor Dalicinos. But that might be a different story for a different time. I plan on doing videos on Bortzes and Dalicinos going forward as part of the Romans of Renown series. In late 995 and early 996, Dalicinos was able to continue to make solid gains. He captured the fort of Al-Lakhma and managed to take many prisoners in the process. He also made 2 attempts to secure the city of Tripolis, possibly because he had heard word that there was an armada being formed in Egypt proper aimed at Byzantine Syria. He thought perhaps that by taking Tripolis he would put the Byzantines in an impregnable situation where this attack by the Fatimids would be bound to fail. At any rate, though, Dalicinos was not able to capture Tripolis despite these 2 attempts. Caliph al-Aziz was deeply distressed when he learned that all of Manju Takin's gains in Syria came unraveled due to the rapid campaign of Basil II. Accordingly, he wanted to arrive himself in Syria and make great gains for his caliphate. So he started to build a grand armada in the Nile, and preparations were underway in early 996. However, in May, the fleet caught fire in the harbor, and people's suspicions fell upon Amalfitan traders out of Italy, who were then scapegoated and massacred until Al-Aziz's viziers restored order. By the way, Amalfi at this time was something of a city-state akin to Genoa, Pisa, or Venice, but on a smaller scale. So they were unfairly scapegoated because the thought was that since they were part of southern Italy, they were sympathetic to the Byzantines. And it is possible that they were responsible for burning the fleet, but most likely it was some other fluke accident. And then once these ships are packed into the harbor, they're all wooden vessels close together. If one catches fire, then they're likely to all go up. There was a certain public-spirited response to this disaster, at least after the massacre ended, however, as Al-Aziz had lumber taken away from public buildings to get underway with construction of a second fleet. However, he fell ill in August and then died in October. So effectively, there was no real Fatimid armada, at least not as originally intended. Nonetheless, the fleet did eventually set sail without the Caliph, and it did arrive to aid Manju Takin, although as we'll see, this was an ill-fated expedition from the start. Manju Takin took his army from Damascus to Aleppo in 996, and then moved to the coast in order to link up with his fleet. His plan was to besiege and capture the coastal city of Antarados in order to further enhance the defenses of Tripolis, which was the real prize for the Fatimids. Predictably, Dalasinos marched down from Antioch to contest the result at Antarados, and at the same time, the Fatimid fleet appeared from the Nile. So, for the first time in a long time, Manju Takin found himself substantially reinforced and having naval supremacy, which is important if you're besieging a coastal city. Unfortunately for the Fatimids, and very fortunately for Dalasinos, a great storm struck the fleet right as it arrived, and most of it got smashed. Manju Takin looked around at the situation, saw it was hopeless, and he fell back. The Byzantines were then able to simply march to the coast and pick up the ships that had been blown ashore. So they got a bunch of ships for nothing, and an entire campaign season was lost due to a storm. So this ended up being effectively a great victory where Dalasinos had to do practically nothing, which is obviously what you want if you can get it. So I have to say that at this point, Dalasinos is looking pretty lucky. But as with many supposedly lucky people, his luck would turn out to be a little bit fickle. From 997 to 998, the Byzantine forces in Syria were relatively quiet. They were not really faced with any threat from the Fatimids, and that is because Manju Takin, the very active governor of Damascus, was much more interested in bringing about a regime change back in Cairo than he was with pressing forward against the Byzantines. He revolted in 997 and asked Basil for support. However, Basil refused to help, probably because he figured that Manju Takin was more of a threat than a young caliph backed by Berbers, who most likely were not terribly accepted by many of the leading powers of the caliphate. By 998, Manju Takin's expedition had failed, and he was then imprisoned for the remaining several years of his life. However, when the city of Tyre revolted against the Fatimids, Basil did send support because he wanted to interrupt Fatimid naval operations. So, effectively for 2 years, aside from a little bit of diplomatic haggling, nothing really took place on the frontier, and Dalasinos and his men were able to get a little bit of rest. By 998, the Fatimids had replaced the imprisoned Manju Takin with Jaish ibn Samsama, and despite the fact that the war against the Byzantines had been something of a colossal failure throughout the decade, the Fatimids were determined to continue pressing forward for whatever reason. Jaish was able to then retake Tyre from rebel forces, which was his first accomplishment. But it would appear that the Byzantines, for the most part, thought that the war was over, or at least that the Fatimids would go back into being passive for at least a while. When a fire broke out at Fatimid-held Apamea, however, the Aleppans saw an opportunity to seize an important nearby city and quickly laid siege to the city before Dalasinos arrived and told them to leave, that this was going to be handled by imperial forces. Both of these allies were eager to get a prize effectively for free, and neither suspected that the Fatimids would be able to really respond with any kind of force or vigor. However, Jaish would prove to be very much up to this challenge. He responded to Apamea's plea for assistance and then moved north with a respectable army that I feel there's evidence the Byzantines didn't think that he could have mustered. So as I promised earlier, once again, all eyes turned to the city of Apamea. which was mostly significant because it was a strategic hub near Aleppo. On July 19, 998, Dalicinos was confronted by Jaish, and this led to a second battle at Apamea. It would appear that both commanders decided to station themselves in the center of their respective armies. This was fairly normal for Arab forces so far as I'm aware, but it was a bit unusual for Byzantine forces. Usually the commanders would station themselves on the wings in order to try to exploit some kind of breakthrough or flanking attack. Dalicinos effectively just went full bore right after his opponent, and the Fatimid center was breaking. So the Byzantines began a pursuit, but as the pursuit was getting underway, Dalicinos himself was mortally wounded. The Fatimids saw Dalicinos go down, and then they rallied, counterattacked, and carried the day, winning a massive victory, even more impressive than the first Battle of Apamea. They inflicted 6,000 to 10,000 casualties on the Byzantine force, and you might have guessed it, this was enough to precipitate another crisis worthy of the Emperor Basil II. Despite the Second Battle of Apamea being a major victory for the Fatimids, they didn't really follow it up much, and Basil, for his part, was not really all that eager to get back to Syria. He thought that it would be best to negotiate peace and just take whatever deal the two sides could hammer out. A status quo agreement would be just fine. The Byzantines still held on to everything that mattered to Basil, but for whatever reason, it appears that the envoys of each side were unable to reach an agreement. It's also possible that perhaps I'm misreading Basil's intentions and he's just delaying, that he did intend to go to Syria, but he wanted his envoys to keep the Fatimids at bay. At any rate, Jaish seems to have not really been that interested in following up his victory. He thought that it was more important to purge Damascus of various anti-Fatimid elements, so he basically spent the next year or so at home dealing with domestic enemies rather than trying to capture fortresses in Byzantine-held territory. This meant that when Basil arrived in Syria on September 20th, 999, that he didn't really have all that many cities he had to retake. So his job was relatively simple, or at least a lot simpler than it should have been if Jaish had really tried to follow up his victory and tried to make some solid gains. His first stop was at the city of Apamea, where he went to the battlefield and had the dead buried ceremoniously and then erected a church over them. We have no direct evidence that he attacked Apamea, so he probably did not, but it is possible that the city came to some agreement with him because he came with a massive army, and Basil had a reputation for being rather ruthless. So I would not be surprised if Apamea re-entered the Byzantine orbit just out of fear of Basil and his army at this time. After doing right by his war dead, Basil then moved to take the city of Shaizar by siege. He succeeded there. This city had been taken by Byzantine forces earlier, but had randomly fallen back to the Fatimids at some unknown date. At the city of Oms, Basil probably assaulted the city and carried it, rather than conducting a siege. And the reason I think that is because when the city fell, the locals of the city took refuge in a church, but the Varangian guard had their blood up, and they decided to burn these people alive and then plunder the city thoroughly. Basil also burned down the city of Arca. Then he moved on to Tripolis, his objective from 4 years earlier. Despite having naval support on his side this time, however, Basil was unable to crack Jaish's defenses, and he even suffered some notable losses during an enemy sally a week into the siege. So Jaish was a determined and skilled defender if he was able to hold off Basil when Basil had a full force in the field. The two seem to have gained a little bit of respect for one another, and by this point both empires recognize the futility of further fighting, as no one is really getting anywhere and they're spending a lot of money and blood to get there. By 1000, both sides were completely ready for peace. By this point, the Fatimid ruler was Al-Hakim, who was a minor, and his vizier at this time was the eunuch Barjawaran. he was in favor of making peace in Syria and focusing on internal problems. As for Basil, we've known all along that he did not want war with the Fatimids, and he would have been willing to make peace at any time. His focus, as always, was on Bulgaria. So the two sides were now in agreement, and therefore they agreed to a 10-year truce. The truce was phrased as more of a ceasefire than a peace. Both powers saw themselves on some level as being the defenders of their respective faiths, so they couldn't really pretend that they were friends. At the same time, they didn't really have that much interest in continuing to butt heads. So despite the fact that the truce was portrayed as a temporary measure, it ended up being long-lasting. Al-Hakim reversed many of Barzhawaran's policies later, after he came of age and executed his former vizier, but he never violated the truce. He never decided to go back to his father's war against Byzantine Syria. Both the Byzantines and the Fatimids had no real desire to change the status quo in Syria, and so it stood for about 50 years. I think that Caldelis is right that Byzantine ambitions didn't really go too far south of Antioch, and that most of the things they captured nearby were more or less to kind of try to shore up their hold on Antioch. They weren't really that interested in going much farther south. Basil was encamped in Cilicia in the winter of 1000, and he was anticipating marching back to Constantinople when the snows cleared. However, he received news that David III of Tau had died, and so he felt that he was given a perfect opportunity to go claim and tour his new possession. Accordingly, he went to Upper Tau in order to establish his presence there, and because he did not yet trust any of the locals, he wanted to travel somewhat light, so he had an advanced force under him, and then he had his trusted general Nicephorus Uranos backing him up with an army shadowing him from a moderate distance. After the tour of Tau, Basil then appointed Nicephorus Uranos as the new dukes of Antioch, and probably also created a new office for a dukes of Iberia based out of the city of Theodosiopolis at around this time. It may have occurred later, but most likely it was at this time. In order to secure the loyalty of all of the various grandees in Tau, Basil handed out court titles. This is something that he also did to surrendering Bulgarians, so this was a common tactic for emperors in general, and for Basil in particular. But there was one person who was very important, whom Basil's titles did not appease, because he happened to hurt this man's feelings, but not giving him a sufficiently grandiose title. By early 1001, Basil was on his way back to Constantinople. However, a crisis was brewing in Tau, which would require him to issue some orders. This was not a crisis that was grave enough for Basil to even consider intervention unless somehow things went really sideways. This is one of the weirder and frankly dumber crises in Byzantine history that I'm aware of. Effectively what happened is that when Basil was handing out titles, Gurgen of Kartli was offended that Basil gave his son a greater title than himself, and therefore decided to invade Tau to avenge his honor. Now, this might sound like an insult, since typically you would think that a father should be at least equal to his son, but Gurgen of Kartli was simply a less big deal than his son, who was Bagrat, the king of Abkhazia. That's why Basil had given Gurgen's son Bagrat a greater title. Bagrat had been the heir to Tau up until 989. He had to be appeased more than Gurgen, who was more or less a no-one. This is the first time Gurgen appears in Byzantine records, by the way, at least I'm aware of. So Basil ordered his general from Antioch, Nicephorus Uranos, to intervene, and effectively this led to a prolonged standoff over the winter of 1001 to 1002 at Basian. Fortunately, this did not require an outright war between Uranos and Gurgen, and this whole thing was resolved by diplomacy. Presumably Gurgen got his title and went home. And then after that, there were no further troubles in Tau for a while. So again, it's a weird incident, but I found it fascinating. so I included it. Over the course of this video, I hope that I've proven that Skylitz's assertion that Basil really neglected the East and didn't accomplish much there is false. Despite the fact that Basil didn't spend much time in the East, nor did he appoint a domesticus of the East, he was still able to accomplish a great deal there, and in fact brought about stability, peace, and even expansion. This is impressive given that this was far from his top priority in the eyes of literally everyone, including writers who were focused specifically on the East itself. As we'll see moving forward, Basil was destined to return to the East for a fourth and final tour in 1021, but that is a story for the fifth part of this series. As for the third and fourth parts of the series, we will be looking at Basil's Bulgarian War, the early part and then the later part, and in the fifth part, when we do the conclusion, what we'll be looking at is effectively how Basil wrapped up things after his epic victory at Clydian, and some of his later campaigns, and even his aspirations. He was planning a massive campaign at the end of his life, which ultimately did not occur. But I don't want to spoil too much of what you couldn't possibly read for yourself in a history book, so I'll leave it there. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian. Remember to like, comment, subscribe. You can follow me on Patreon, and do all the things that people are supposed to do to support creators that they like. Peace out.